evening, good night, whatever time it is where anyone might be seeing this. And welcome, my fluffy little bunnies, to the first and a half episode of the International Dagger Symposium. We had some slight technical difficulties the first time we did this. So this is basically the first thing, because Pixar didn't happen, right? So it didn't happen. We are going to talk about the very important question of why dagger though, in the first place. And we are going to continue talking about the topic of grappling and dagger and what the connections are later on. We is a slightly confusing term for those people who don't know who we are, but that is going to be solved in the first round of introducing ourselves and our idea and answer to the question of why dagger though. So I won't be introducing you because you'll be doing that yourself. I, for my part, am Jan Hoffman from Tremonia-Fechten in Germany, and I have the honor of hosting this little assembly tonight. And I will be asking the very nice person to my left, at least on my screen, I don't know how this turns out on other screens, which is Björn Rugstad, and he is going to introduce himself and tell us, why dagger though, Björn?
Yes. So my name is Björn Rugstad. I'm from Visby Historical Fencing School. And to answer the why dagger though, well, basically dagger was my gateway drug into HEMA. I come from I've done knife-based martial arts for 30 years or something, predominantly Southeast Asian silat and that kind of stuff. And then at some point we started, me and a friend of mine who runs a Krav Maga club. We started watching Matt Easton's early stuff, and he had some video where he presented how grappling was really important for dagger, and he also made some assumptions that this would be the case with modern knife, and we both were like, that sounds really weird. That sounds like not exactly how we view it. But we kind of, instead of course, the knee-jerk reaction is to say, you're full of shit. But we were like, no, we're going to try to find out why does he say it. First of all, is what he's saying correct? Is it correct from a historical point of view? If it's correct from a modern point of view, that's another discussion. I'm going to skip that part. But if it's correct from a historical point of view, and if it's correct, why? So then we started looking into daggers, and then I started through contact with Roger Norling from Gothenburg Free Fencers Guild. I got into contact with him, and he recommended that I start looking into Meyer, which was basically how much I knew about it already. He said, go buy a Meyer manual, and I said, okay, Meyer manual. So I bought the Meyer manual, and we started looking into that, and that was really good because Meyer, at least unlike many of the other systems, is actually a system. I have later on looked into BPL 3281, which is not a system. I mean, at least not from what we can guess. It's a collection of techniques. It maybe was a system at some point, but from what we have, it's not the description of a system. So we started with that, and then I quite soon got into some trouble with distance, and then I went to Dave Rawlings. I was teaching a knife seminar in London, and so I went to take private lessons with Dave to say, you have to solve this distance issue because I'm messing everything up. And he basically solved the issue for me, and then that's how we just progressed from there, I guess. And then to answer the question in a broader sense, because this is something that I think came to my attention once I started really looking into it, is that dagger should have a much more prominent position in HEMA. So if we look at the amount of pages and ink spent on daggers, I think it should probably be the most important weapon in HEMA, perhaps perhaps that and wrestling. I don't know, but I mean, dagger is at least at the absolute top, much more than longsword, for example. And also I think that if you look, it makes sense because in a historical context, it was probably a weapon that was carried almost all the time, so it would probably see more action just because of that. So for that, for my purpose, I'm like my goal is to make like dagger into a fence, interpret dagger in a way that it becomes fencing, just like any other weapon, or not just like, but in the same kind, to the same degree that we can see in other weapons. So like make daggers great again. I don't know, something like this. Does that make sense?
Me, it does. Yes. So you kind of went on it about it in like two ways. So why dagger for you personally, and it seems there's some kind of knife-based background that prompted you to start with that. Maybe if you had done more Olympic fencing in your former days, maybe you would have started with something else. And then you went on to the broader sense of why dagger, like in general, why should everyone be doing more dagger? And I'd be interested to hear about both of these things from Predrag's perspective.
Well, yeah, I'm Predrag Nikolic from Zornhau, based in Offenbach near Frankfurt. And yeah, I started doing HEMA more just like, okay, yeah, our club was more predominantly going for longsword. And I thought, okay, sounds nice, but they said, oh yeah, we also do some dagger fighting and some wrestling and staff fighting. And I said, okay, dagger sounds really nice. And staff fighting, yeah, great. And wrestling, I've been doing judo. I started doing judo when I was 10 for a few years. Then I went into Aikido for a few years, did some jiu-jitsu just as a sideline and so on. So I always liked the martial arts, the unarmed martial arts aspect. And somehow it just turned out that I was supposed to be the instructor for wrestling and dagger fighting in our club. It just happened. And because we didn't have a teacher who was specialized on that, and so that's how I got into it. I focused mainly on doing wrestling, but got into that actually dagger fighting is just wrestling with a pointy stick in your hand. So it's just an extension of wrestling. And so for me, it fits perfectly because, as Björn had already said, medieval times, people used to have a dagger with them most of the time. Well, not all the time, I think if they were in the bathtub, they didn't have a dagger with them. But otherwise, it was part of the clothing. So the chance of you having a dagger with you to defend yourself, or the other person having a dagger with them to attack you, was quite high. So it should be really a basic thing to know how to defend against dagger. And I think a lot of the plays, especially in Maya, are for defending against the dagger attack. And also other manuals you have, what's it called? Hundfeld, for example, Liegnitzer. Those are always defending against a dagger attack. Maya has some where you don't have a dagger in your hand, so you're surprised and then he attacks you. And so that was really interesting for me. I still focus more on the wrestling part because in the end, as long as I don't have a dagger in my hand, I will wrestle the other guy down. And in the end, try to get their dagger and stab them with their dagger. So yeah, best thing, they kill themselves. And I didn't even touch the dagger. And that's why, for me, dagger is a nice thing. Still, my focus is on wrestling. But it's just, yeah, it's an integral part of that. And you can't do the one without the other, or you should not do overall, even though I mainly do wrestling, but always I know stuff in the dagger things. And I can always say, okay, and this is the wrestling thing that you do in this dagger section now. So it just becomes one. In the end, if you train certain wrestling moves, especially some arm grips and so on, that's perfect for dagger fighting. And yeah, and it's totally different to modern fighting with a knife, because of how the dagger was shaped and so on, what the purpose was. So nowadays it's more slashing. In the olden days, it was more like stabbing, and that also makes a difference in the grappling things.
Yeah, as well as like maybe lengths and like specifics of design of things. But yeah, we're kind of going into our later topic there. We'll just store that segue for later and get back on the train when Daniele has taught us his personal story of white dagger though and his opinion on why dagger though in general.
Yes, hello. My name is Daniele Cicero. I'm from Düsseldorf. I have an own Facebook site, which you might know, which is called Citadelle Düsseldorf, where I post some HEMA stuff. I'm also part of the group called Bellum Nobile, which is a HEMA group here in Düsseldorf. And I was the instructor in the PSV Oberhausen some years ago. Yeah, pretty much it's the same like Predrag, that I'm very much invested in wrestling because of my judo background, because of my karate background. And so daggers seemed to be the natural expansion of this. And yeah, and I like it also, what little Björn said, I can also yeah, strengthen that point in that sense that it's a very, very good didactical tool. And I found that out a little bit later on, but it's a very good didactical tool because you cannot really outsource a lot on this weapon. A lot of things you have to do yourself. So basically, like I treat it like hand fencing / wrestling with a short, hard object. Yeah. So that's like I treat it, and so you can train at first with a little bit of motivation of having a weapon in your hand. You can train a lot of things, just distance, footwork, and so on. And yeah, and without going too much into wrestling, which is it's not only within the HEMA community a huge hindrance, but in general because it's motorically so challenging. And therefore you have a little bit of a workaround, so a good middle of both sides of fencing and of wrestling. Yes, and this is why I think dagger is an exceptionally is the didactical tool in HEMA, or should be, in my opinion. It's yeah, at least I treat it like it is. You can learn very much of it, and yeah, and I also think that is the thing in HEMA besides wrestling where you can have a little bit of self-defense part. Yeah, swords and so on. They are not really. Yeah, I mean, you can take a stick, of course, but swords are not really modern day weapons. But a dagger is a knife basically, and so yeah, that's for me.
Yeah, so basically the idea that we've heard a few times now, and that's where I'm going to kind of get in, is that the dagger is very close to wrestling. Almost feels like an extension of wrestling. But like I said, it's basically wrestling with something in your hand, and Daniele kind of chimed in on that. And maybe that's why I started with the dagger as well, because when I got into HEMA, I started out doing HEMA in Glasgow with Keith Farrell, doing the Highland Broadsword. Then when I came back to Germany, looked for a club in my area and found Tremonia Fechten, who were just like Predrag's club, were predominantly doing longsword and just like looking into other things, you know, on a once-off workshop basis, basically. And I soon found out that longsword just isn't my thing, like my style. And I was more intrigued looking at sources, having looked at sources for the first time with more one-handed things, and then found the text about Ringen. And what I really started with getting into the knives and daggers section was actually the Bowie knife, which I played around with Katarina, one of the instructors at our club. and then that kind of became its own thing, and then we did Bowie knife for a while, and then we switched that over to the dagger after I got more into that, basically all around the time that Daniele and I cooperated on a workshop at our Fechtschule event. So there again, there was this thing about Ringen and the Bowie knife and the dagger, all of these kinds of things that felt very natural, mainly probably because I too have a background in unarmed martial arts, in my case Jiu-Jitsu, which probably outside of Germany doesn't mean much to people, but it's basically this kind of martial art that was developed for German police forces back in the, I don't know, 80s, 90s or something, I don't know. So that's what I had been doing before for years. So maybe that's again why that felt more natural. And if I had been an Olympic fence, I would have done something else. I don't know. But I also soon noticed that a lot of the things that had been talked about in longsword practice, especially in the German school of longsword, many of the terms made more sense to me or felt more directly applicable in the dagger. For example, when you talk about, which basically just means feeling what your opponent is going to do, and so you can react to it, which people try to learn like by proxy twice, because you've got two swords in between you and the opponent, and I'm supposed to feel what you are doing mitigated by two long steel thingies, which is it's way more easier to directly feel your movement when I'm wrestling with you. And then because, as we've said, the dagger is practically wrestling with something in your hand, it's the same with the dagger, right? I can directly feel what you are doing. I've got contact to your arms or your body directly at some point. So I noticed that is something that is a good tool to teach these things. And then I had a closer look at Fiore, for example, and in the sources, like the old masters tell us, for example, in this case, he says that if you understand the dagger, you also gain a good understanding of all the other weapons. Yeah, that's why I felt more and more compelled to do more and more dagger, fell more and more in love with it, because there's like so much to discover there and so many things that help you understand basic things in a very direct way that you would get in a very more abstract way in other weapon systems, like one-handed swords or the long sword, or even like staff or whatever, right? So yeah, I basically have to chime in with you guys and say that the way that the dagger, because the dagger is so closely related to grappling and wrestling, that makes it such a fantastic and important weapon in my point of view, and should get way more attention in the broad HEMA scene. I think it's getting more and more over time, but there should be more. So that kind of takes us to the connection between grappling and the dagger. We've started getting into that, and we are pointing at me.
Yes, yes. Mostly because you mentioned now that you do that. Do I understand you correctly? You have predominantly studied Fiore. This is like the focus of your study. And Predrag talked a little bit about sources. I kind of missed what is, I mean, I know because I know Daniele, but I think for the purposes of our audience, we should ask, Daniele, could you tell us a little bit what sources you have mostly been looking at?
So at first my sources were Fiore de Liberi, because it's a complete chapter. It's actually the biggest part of the book and seems complete, and therefore, and it's quite easy because it's more like a shield and sword system where you have left arm for defending and the right arm for attacking. So I could get into this and did it on a combative level, basically. That's I need to go into detail, but I won't now do it now. But Fiore de Liberi is the first one, and then I went through several one. and it ended up that you get me hooked up in Maya. That's what happened, and that's where I stuck right now. And I think that's my to-go source right now.
Thank you. Sorry,
thanks.
sorry. I just thought that
No.
this was important to get everybody's perspective on it.
Yeah, right. It's a good thing because even though I think we might all agree that a lot of the things are very similar in dagger overall, because we all have the same physique and it's the same kind of weapon, there are slight differences in the sources and the way they go about it. So it's very important to know what sources you're using. You might find very similar things in Fiore and in, for example, Hundfeld or Liegnitzer. They might be doing the exactly same thing, but sometimes they do very different things. And you find that there is a focus in Hundfeld that's you can read between the lines that this is more about armored fighting, maybe. That's at least what they had in mind, and which you don't necessarily have with Fiore, and so on and so on. So it's a very important point to make. So yeah, maybe this is where we transition into the second topic that we had made up for today, which is grappling and the dagger. We already talked about the very close connection it has from our point of view, basically being wrestling with something in your hand. But I think it, to me at least, what makes it really clear is if we look at, I hope you can see that, if we look at, for example, Fiore, the beginning of the dagger section, it's basically the third page of the dagger section, I think. The first is him showing postas, the second is him speaking in the first person as the dagger about how awesome he is. And then we get these pictures explaining how to do dagger fighting, and you will notice that he only has a dagger in one of the pictures. The other three, there he's carrying some arms, which symbolize that he can break your arms and stuff. Here he symbolizes that he can throw you. Here he symbolizes locks, that he can take you in. And even this one, that the only one that he carries the dagger in, is for disarms. So he took that dagger from someone. So the four main points in dagger fighting, from Fiore's perspective at least, is basically wrestling. It's disarming, locking, breaking arms, and throwing people. None of them is, he's not talking about actually stabbing people at this point. And a lot of the things that he shows us is just someone's attacking you, here's what you do, like Predrag mentioned. Is there one of these things for you guys? Is there one of these things where you went, so this is basically just wrestling? Has there been this aha moment in some way or another?
I think to answer that question, it would behoove us to define what wrestling is.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to try?
I can try, and then you tell me where we agree and disagree, or if you'd like to expand upon it. So I would say that if for the purposes of a dagger, I would say that grappling or wrestling is whenever I am grabbing my opponent, not the weapon, or similarly exerting leverage upon the body rather than the weapon. Does that make any sense? So, for example, if I block with my offhand, that would automatically be some sort of grappling or wrestling. Whereas if I block with my dagger and manipulate my opponent through the weapon, then I'm not doing grappling or wrestling. Do you understand why I would differentiate between them? Because otherwise, in the end, anything is grappling. So just to keep it separate. And from there, of course, on to takedowns and all kinds of wrestling, but that is at least where it starts for me. And this is basically also, by the way, why I both think it's important to define, and why I reacted upon Matt Easton's claim originally. Because when he said grappling, I was thinking Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Because I didn't have a HEMA background at that point. So when he was saying grappling, I was like, are you crazy? You want to go on the ground and roll around if somebody has a knife? you're mad. Yeah. So hence the definition part. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, I think there's one thing that comes into play, because grappling for me is wrestling. So because there is a difference. And in the German, you have the Ringen. Ringen is, if you look at the manuals, and I have a lot of discussions on that for a long time. I've been doing it now for 20 years, more than 20 years. And all people, oh no, we have some ground fighting things in wrestling. And I always say, well, actually, those are for armored combat, wrestling in armor, because there they make sense. If you just got usual clothing, so everyday work clothes, those quite often don't make sense, especially because the other person might have a dagger with them, and I have to on the ground I have to control the other person so that they cannot reach for their or my dagger. And some of the techniques, yeah, control them, but not in that position with armor on. Okay, I don't mind, because they will not be able to get into my in the weak places of my armor from that position on. And so that's why I would never say it's grappling, because if we go ground fighting, that's from later times. If we look at some of the plays that we have that are mentioned, like the Ringen Groupline, it ends if somebody touches the ground with something else than the feet. So if we go for Kriegsring, so really for the combat wrestling, not just the plays, but the combat wrestling, in the battlefield or in the street where you might have to defend against multiple opponents, you don't want to go to the ground. So if you look at most of the techniques that you have, there are some where you go to the ground with them as well. Yes. About 5 or 6, I think. But most are, I will try to be upright at the end of the throw, and they're on the ground, so that I can still be aware of what's coming around me. And for me, wrestling is controlling the other person so that they cannot attack me. So if I have a dagger in the hand and I swoop their dagger hand with my dagger in, so go around and pull them, that's also wrestling. So that's where I would differ with your definition, because I'm still using part of my body, but also the dagger to lock their hand in to manipulate them. So if I try to manipulate the other person with part of my body or an extension of my body, that for me is already wrestling. It's not grappling. Because if we define grappling as going to the ground, I agree, that's not it. If I define wrestling, controlling, manipulating the other person so that they cannot harm me, it's not that I will harm them, but they cannot harm me, then for me it's more. And somebody mentioned in some of the menus, I'm always forgetting which one it was, that wrestling is the basis for all the other combat fighting. And if we look at it, it is the basis of everything, because it will be with us all the time. I might lose my dagger, but usually I still have my hands and feet and arms. If not, I'm done for. And I have a different problem. But yeah.
If I would add something, sorry, do you want to say something, Jan?
No, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I would say the modern term that is the closest to what we are thinking of is maybe something around trapping or hand fighting. A wrestler would say hand fighting, so something like arm wrestling. In the sources they call it arm wrestling, just grabbing hands, binding hands. That's the first one, and then we are going into throws. Not like hugging people just senselessly. I mean, that's just giving an idea. With Maya, I came up with at least I think that I have a more analytical way to describe what is going on with the wrestling. There is, since fighting with short weaponry is basically very volatile. You don't have a bind, or you don't. It's very high frequency, very, very chaotic, and that's actually the problem. That's what everybody thinks they're fencing with daggers.
We lost you, Daniele. We can't hear you.
No.
Come
You're
back.
making a point.
Yeah.
And points are important with daggers.
Yes.
The pointy bit.
So while we wait for Daniele to come
Yeah,
back,
we just cut that out.
yeah, but I would maybe say also this, that if I understand you correctly, Predrag, you're basically saying that when you're exerting control, but not for the purpose of causing damage with the weapon. Now we're getting you back. Sorry. Oh no, we're not. He almost came back.
Robotic scream from the void.
Yeah.
Yes. So just to is that so? You'd say that also if you use the weapon to control, not to directly damage, that would also be wrestling.
For me, that is part of the wrestling because I try to control. I try not to be, hurt in a way.
I think
in a real fight, I will try to hurt the other person,
of course,
because either them or me.
Mm-hmm.
But in a play, it would be okay. I'm controlling you, and that's okay. I don't have to destroy you or break your arm. I can do that. But so most of the techniques, if you really go on through with them, you will hurt your opponent. But you can always,
Sorry, the break was so long. I thought you had been done. The thing that you mentioned was also what I had in mind when Björn gave his definition, which I think kind of works because he went on to say, like when I control the body of my opponent with my body instead of a weapon, or if I control his body directly instead of his weapon. The recording again. We just continue talking about the point that Predrag had made about whether or not using the dagger to bind your opponent is part of wrestling, because he said he would contradict Björn in that, which we kind of said was, as long as I directly control the body of my opponent, that is kind of part of wrestling. And that includes the dagger in that way, especially because it often isn't just the dagger, but it's this kind of praying mantis thing where you also include your lower arm. But you were going to talk about like hand fighting in modern wrestling, I think was the point that you had been making when you fell off. So maybe you want to get back into that.
It's a little bit more about the source why this is wrestling, or at least in my opinion is wrestling, or why it's connected to this, because in fencing we need control, and control is only via a bind. I mean, you cannot make a whole martial art only by voiding and riposte, and it doesn't work anymore. You have to somehow bind the person, and since blade to blade contact with such a short weaponry is not possible, and it's a volatile fencing, you need to bind with the arms. Maya does it he does it more Dusak style. It's like Dusak fencing with a blade, with a dagger. He just cuts into it, but doesn't cut into it, but just cuts arm to arm, or gets arm to arm, and therefore he gets the bind. Fiore does it otherwise. He does it with the left hand, for example, but they all want some kind of bind, because in the end, if it's not fixated, the blade of the opponent, you get into trouble. So that's the idea, I think, why we have so much wrestling or grabbing, whatever, seizing in this kind of combat, because it is necessary to bind. We don't have blades to do that for us. We cannot really outsource a lot of this to the blade. My opinion, or perhaps in terms of terminology, what mostly happens is we have in the sources two kinds of wrestling. We have arm wrestling and we have body wrestling. And body wrestling is just grabbing the body and throwing them around. And arm wrestling is just like more grabbing and locks and trapping and so on. And this is what we see mostly gonna happen, or at least in the first instances. So we are hopefully on the same page, and especially for viewers, that they know what we're talking about. Wrestling is not grappling like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or something, like the whole game of stand-up, locking up and binding arms. Yeah.
So I think the point that we all agree on is the direct control of the opponent's body, instead of trying to control the weapon, which, as you said, usually happens in the bind of the weapons, and especially with the dagger and with the Ringen, you are binding on the opponent's body, and that's kind of where we start calling it Ringen or wrestling.
In this case,
which I think.
Sorry, in
Especially
this
what?
case, especially limbs, meaning
Yeah.
arms in this case. Yeah.
So I think that is something that I've heard people talk about Ringen as if it was some kind of distance, like you get into Ringen as a distance because that's kind of distance where you could be doing all the things that we've been talking about. But I think the point where it actually becomes Ringen is when you bind with your opponent's body, when you exert force on your body, on the body of your opponent, instead of any weapons that might or might not be there. The very important thing, I also forget which source that's from, but the very important quote of alles Fechten kommt aus dem Ringen that Predrag has brought up before. So all fighting, because Fechten, which we translate into fencing today, is basically in the olden days just meant fighting. It has the same source. If you look at the words, it looks similar as well. It has the same linguistic root, whereas fencing comes from to defend, defense, right? Basically, the Ringen has not been separated from the other fighting in the mind of the medieval martial artist. It's something that we might draw a line today that maybe they haven't even drawn, but just for our purposes, we haven't made clear when we talk about grappling with the dagger, when we talk about Ringen, that's what we mean. That's when we directly bind with the opponent. And I think the one of the aspects that has been brought up why this is such an important thing is the context that we see this weapon in, right? We have, the way I see it, two very different contexts, both of which have been mentioned, but both of which lead us to the same conclusion of we need to start doing some wrestling now. One of them is the everyday, I'm just going out casually wearing my dagger kind of context. And the other one is highly armed, like judicial combat or some kind of duel situation in full armor, right? Completely different situations, but both of which kind of emphasize the dagger in one way or the other. The first, just because that's what I probably have, what I'm probably carrying around. The latter one, because that might be the only way to get into the gaps of an opponent's armor, because I can try to parry riposte all day without getting there. And that's where we get the what is called the Unterhalten in, I think it's Hundfeld, not sure. Might be, I think it's Hundfeld. Yeah. It's called the Unterhalten, which is the kind of ground wrestling that Predrag has talked about before, which is just there to keep them down while you get your dagger out or their dagger out. Yeah. So like context seems to be something that favors this kind of weapon over other weapons that are more in a context of swords are for the nobility and so on. I think the dagger is a very pedestrian weapon in that way, but also a very, very specialized fighting tool for the noble.
The source you mentioned, sorry, just chime in. One thing. The source we mentioned, every fencing comes from the wrestling. It's actually from the Polhausbuch, so 3227a itself. So from the Lichtenau, the original Lichtenauer source, where this is coming from. Just saying.
Cool.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And there was two things that we touched upon now, and one thing is that the fact that unlike not all weapons, but not completely unlike Lange's Messer, for example, but to a larger degree than with a Messer or with a Dusak, you can actually maintain a grab and continue using the dagger fully. Whereas if you grab somebody with a long sword, you kind of have to like. There are specific techniques where you could get in with it. You could like do some half swording and do it, but you're into very, very specific territory. Whereas with a dagger, you grab somebody and you just continue doing what you were doing previously. So that kind of also is where the connection is, because you don't let go of your opponent in order to put your weapon online. Whereas if I'm fencing with a longsword and I get into grappling range, ideally I would perhaps want to, escape grapple in order to bring the full weight of my weapon to bear. Whereas this really isn't an issue with a dagger.
Is the keyword there range? Is it because the range, the effective range of my longsword is different from grappling range? Whereas, like if I'm in a like this gives me like no reach advantage whatsoever, right? This is the same range as just having my fist out, right? So is it because there's no change in range that the dagger is the logical next step from Ringen?
I think so. And also it is the one weapon. This is something that Predrag kind of touched upon, and maybe also Daniele. It is the one weapon where we see a lot of techniques describing a person who does not have a weapon against somebody who has a weapon. I think Fiore might have like occasions where he kind of like shows one technique against some longsword if you don't have something. I mean, you can, in some manuals, you can occasionally see one or two techniques where, oh, if you don't have a weapon, somebody attacks you with a spear. It's like, you can try this, but mostly you'll just die. but in dagger, there is quite a lot.
But that doesn't look good in the manuscript.
It does. But in dagger, there's quite a lot of that. And even to the point, which is something that is really interesting to me, is that the one manual which is like the most different, the one dagger manual which is the most different from all the others, in my opinion, is Marozzo, where he teaches some sort of kind of like rapier fencing almost with or like side sword fencing with a dagger. But when he teaches empty hand versus dagger, he expects everybody else to behave exactly the way you see. Actually, he's like 80% of his unarmed versus dagger techniques are exactly the same techniques as you see in Meyer. So that yeah, there's an article on Hroar, I think, where Roger Norling made a comparison. So there's actually like an 80% overlap in the unarmed versus so yeah, but that was kind of sidetracked a bit.
But I think it's logical. I mean, I think all of you have tried, if somebody's using the modern grip, like I want to stab you like this, compared to the grip you have in the German manuals, mostly where it's, yeah, push that right into you, but coming from above. Or so, and if you try to defend somebody who's stabbing like this, it's a lot more difficult. Some of the techniques actually don't work. You might try to block them, get them to the side, but you will not have the same control without being stabbed. At the same time, this, if you attack like this, coming straight forward and the dagger is in front of you, you have a higher reach, so the other person can be further away, but you don't have as much force. This one really brings in, and that's where we once again get into armored fighting. I think a lot of the manuals we have, even though it's also for not just only nobility, but if we look at it, a lot of the fencing masters were paid by nobility to fight for them or to teach them. So, and a lot of those were for judicial duels or so on, armored combat. So a lot of the techniques really use at least in my opinion, correct me if you do, really tell me if you see differently, were for just this thing, armored combat. I do train some things if I don't have armor with me and if I have to take it, but if somebody's angry with me or trying to attack me, I don't think in the olden days, maybe it was like this, that everybody's coming, okay, come on, here's my dagger, come on, give me your money. They were trying to kill you, and if you try to kill somebody, Arangi, you mostly, as we have in the longsword, the Zornhau, the prominent cut you have comes from the right side, slashing downwards if you're a right-handed guy. Same with the dagger. Dagger hand here, and this is where you get strength in. So that's one of the basic things. Everything else, and you see some of the first techniques in Meyer, but also in different manuals, is defending when somebody comes from the left side. So they attack from the right side. And that's where the basis is. And later on, you get onto more and more advanced stuff. But in the beginning, you really have to defend against the first initial onslaught. That's at least my opinion. And then you can go for your dagger because, oh God, I got prevented it. Now I'm prepared. Or maybe I've already killed the other guy. So that's maybe one of the things why Marozzo, even though his dagger fighting is more like, oh yeah, we're going to cut you because I don't know when Marozzo was a little bit later, wasn't it? Earlier than Meyer, but later than, for example, some of the other Italian guys. And so clothing style had changed. You can see that in German manuals as well. Look at the early things, Lichtenauer and so on, and then go to Joachim Meyer, the clothing. The style has changed completely. Same with Italian style. They're already in Renaissance time. Not even medieval anymore, they're Renaissance. And a lot of things change, the dagger style changes. Germany came a little bit later. Depends on where you are in Germany. But it came from Italy high up to Germany, and they just took over, and yeah, that's now our style, but it was the Italian style. So also the weapons changed. The rapier was, I think, firstly more in Italy or France, and Meyer was one of the first in Germany to apply that, as far as I know. I never done rapier, so I'm not too sure about that. But that's, I think, also the evolution of a lot of things that comes in to play with that part. Why things change, but still, if you want to teach somebody, oh yeah, how to defend, yeah, grab for the wrist if he's stabbing like this, yeah, I don't have that much control. So, oh yeah, I teach you because I want to be, I think it's still a little bit capitalism thing. I want to get money from that. So I teach you how you could defend to get you to be successful. If in the end, well, if the guy's attacking differently, well, you're screwed. But you're screwed anyway. So
I think the very important point there being the change of manuals and how they go about things, and maybe the explanation for why some things are wildly different from others. We always have to think about, like, if we look at very, very early sources, they are as far away from the late sources as we are now, almost, right? So if you look at the I-33, and from now on, and some of the sources that we have are like wham bam in the middle. So we can't look at all of them through the same lens and say, yeah, no, that's the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
But as you rightly know, so the context is very important. In the early sources, we often have these works either written for nobility or basically given to them. Like you can see in the writing, they say this is for him or her, basically him mostly. And even with like Fiore, who basically always shows the people in like regular clothing, and has a lot of things that work in regular clothing, and he even has this famous picture of this guy sitting in a restaurant or a bar or something and defending against someone jumping over the table trying to stab him. So this seems pretty mundane and everyday lifey, but even he includes things like, and this specifically works well if you're wearing armor. So even he has that at least in the back of his mind. So the armor is kind of always there. And for my part, I think that the dagger as a weapon of choice, especially in this rondel dagger form that we mostly see in the manuscripts, this probably comes from a nobility kind of context. This is a weapon that has gone through the evolution of I'm perfect for being pushed through gaps in armor, which is also fine for other clothing that people wear. It's easier to stab with it. But I think that this kind of trickled down to the more bourgeois, and then later on the gentile people on the street from a more noble context. And this is a weapon pretty much designed for armed combat in the first place. At least that's the idea that I have got. You might correct me if I'm wrong on that one, but to me it feels like the armor is always there in the background of the dagger, even though I as a person, pretty much don't care for armored fighting at all. But I still feel that it's pretty important for the dagger to know where it comes from.
I think that when it comes to the dagger, there's the specific rondel shape like this, which is this part is what makes it a rondel dagger. There's like some idea that the construction of the blade has something to do with being a rondel dagger, which is no. You see this kind of sharp blades, and you see triangle shapes, and you see all kinds of things. But the thing is, these rondels, they assist you if you are armored. Like
that one specifically, just to try, that's
yes.
what makes the rondel dagger, right? That
Yes,
one
yes,
might even be the
this might
pommel
be-
or whatever.
yes,
That
yes.
one is the thing that makes the rondel, yeah.
So drawing it in armor is far easier. This is a weapon which is really easy to draw. If you, and I started doing this when I do play with other weapons, I usually carry a dagger with me and try to draw it at some point during the fencing. And it's wearing, I've tried with like more like bollock dagger shaped grips, and they're like rubbish to grab, but this is like you almost get it every time. So I think perhaps more than an anti-armor weapon, it's a pro-armor weapon. It's a weapon made for the person who carries armor.
While armored weapon.
While armored. And then, of course, I think it's like you said, the trickle-down effect is basically like this used to be like a weapon that, the guys in the army, but it's like people, occasionally wear camouflage pants who are not in the military. And it's
Tactical.
yeah, exactly. So, and this has always been the thing. I think that the military might and the nobility was setting the standards, and by the mid 15th century, you start seeing civilians carrying rondel daggers because it was like, yeah, and you're also making a point. You're telling somebody that you're dangerous. Look, I'm wearing this weapon, which is fantastic in a self-defense context because it might deter somebody from actually fighting you. No, he looks really dangerous. It's like people have AR-15s today who don't need the AR-15s. It's just because they kit them up. They look like there's like a goddamn SWAT team. It's because it's cool. But also, I think, because like in Meyer's case, for example, and I do think this is the case with some of the other manuals, but I will be very careful about that, is that he said, but Joachim Meyer says very clearly that it's for dagger. Of course, rondel dagger is not a word, so historically speaking, it's a modern term. But he also says that it's for daggers and other similar implements, basically. But this is also because you talked about the evolution over time, and you can say like, but in the time of Lichtenauer, which we don't even know if really existed, but let's assume he existed. At his time, there was maybe 3,000 schooled fencers in Europe. By the time you get to Meyer, you have 3,000 in his city, and they're no longer the people who are having this kind of school fencer aren't predominantly the nobility anymore. It's like the burghers who have the license to run these competitions and everything, because that they on the term that they will help defend the city if they're attacked. So all of a sudden it's changed, but this also changes how you look at it, because the moment you have, if you look at the longsword fence, our interpretation of the longsword fencing, which is perhaps the HEMA weapon which has the most interpretation, could we say like this?
Yeah, most work has been done on that, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's because there's most people fencing with it. So the more people you have who fence with it, the more advanced techniques you will see being pulled off on a regular basis, just by sheer numbers. And I think that's also something you're seeing, that certain things become more interesting as time goes by. By the time Marozzo, there's all of a sudden loads more people doing things, and you have other contexts, and yeah, this kind of things changes. Also, not only the armor or not armor, because I think a lot of the context we see, there's almost most of the context we see is at least based on the illustrations. There's no armor, almost. And there are some exceptions, but the majority of the dagger manuals we see are no armor, regardless of when. Is my opinion, at least when having looked through them.
Yeah, the question is that like artistic choice? Is there a reason for that? Like same with the bare hands in all of the fully armored fighters. I don't know about that. I know with Fiore you basically have no armor at all, and then you have these lines of this works specifically good in armor. But I'm not sure about. But he definitely shows them without armor, so there is an unarmored context in the foreground here.
You do have some, you have in Talhofer, you have pictures of dagger techniques in armor.
Oh yes, they exist. They exist.
Yeah.
I think that they are a
majority.
I can just really, the only I remember is really in Talhofer where he always showing a lot of things in armored combat and so on. So, and also the dagger appears in armor. But that's actually the only where I can remember it.
There's at least two more. There's one which only shows armored dagger fencing, which, funnily enough, in that manual, they're not exclusively not doing rondel dagger, which is weird. But Daniele, you showed me. Is it Blumendes des
Kampfes, the Flower of Battle, which is the German pimped version of Fiore de Liberi.
Yeah.
And either they're wearing armor, or they're actually what might be seeing is training equipment, because you see that they have metal gloves and helmets. Now the rest is covered by fabric. This might be fabric covering the armor. We know that was a thing. But it's interesting that you almost exclusively see armored hands and armored face. It could actually be one of the few instances we're actually seeing somebody, taking protective measures in order to fight. I don't know, but this is like speculation. We don't know, but at least it's armor involved. Is that you agree with me, Daniele?
It's armor involved. I would say I agree with you. Will say okay, that could be training equipment, but that could be also just soldier armor to a certain degree. I cannot really. The distinction is not clear, in my opinion.
I think we might spend some more time, than we've already done now, talking about certain context of certain eras of dagger, just to bring it back to what is actually the more topic of tonight is how this connection to armor may be influenced, a lot of the sources being about grappling, because or like Ringen, because that's the only way to actually do something with the dagger instead of just like hitting the breastplate of your opponent. And on the other hand, we get this very mundane context of you can use this every day. But in the way that Predrag has described, if you just use this as pull it out and stick it in, instead of just going for the more cumbersome movement of trying to get it out in the front grip, which we also get in the manuscripts, right? We also in Fiore and in Hundfeld and in Lignit Science, we also get the stabs from below. But the predominant thing that we see is like get it out and stab at someone. So that's something you might encounter in a mundane context as well, predominantly if someone pulls the dagger in anger at you. And that's something that, then again, we have there's basically no reach advantage, and you have to get into wrestling, because otherwise, as Daniele said, it's a very volatile thing, and you're just gonna get stabbed repeatedly if you don't stop the other person from doing that. So there are these two kind of distinct elements that kind of give us the same effect of, you better start doing some ringen now, buddy.
And the fact
I would say I would put these points a little bit, or I would discuss them a little bit, because the two concepts, first, armor in these manuscripts is, I think, one of the major essentials, because what we see, what they're using, for example, if we take Talhofer, most of these weapons are many weapons are just armor weapons, like poleaxes, like the daggers perhaps here. So, and the longswords. I mean, longsword is a weapon that usually is coming out of an armored context. And therefore, I think, yes, the armor is a very prominent thing in the whole thing, in the whole context. And the other thing I want to say is we shouldn't get into the misconception that the dagger grip is the number one to go, because when we look at the manuscripts, especially Talhofer, or Paulus Hector Meyer, they start with the knife grip, and they have a lot of knife grip. I would say 50% of it. And we shouldn't just say, okay, German dagger is just this grip. It's perhaps also in our modern view a little bit more the prominent one when we look at it. And in many manuscripts, it is the number one thing to go. Yeah, but there are a lot of manuscripts where this is not necessarily the part. So I wouldn't go too far to say, okay, this kind of grip is necessary, and it's for armored fighting, and there's something in between, I would say. There's a little bit in between.
So to be clear, when you're saying knife grip, you mean this grip, and when
yes, forward grip.
Yes, and the other one is this. And I would agree with you. First of all, I would say that this grip is shown in almost every manual. I think this grip is more common, but Meyer, who seems to not like this, even he mentions it. And Paulus Hector Meyer does quite a lot of it, I think. So I absolutely think it's there. But for the reason I brought up Marozzo is that he exclusively does point up and I think in that case he's unique in his dagger versus dagger. He exclusively does point up to my understanding.
Look at, for example, okay, these I wouldn't say unique, but very rare, because we have another source, and this is Paulus Karl, which starts with a cut to the arm, with an under and an overcut to the arm in that knife grip.
Yes.
And
which is also very rare.
That is rare. These are too rare. So yeah, okay, we can say basically unique, to a certain degree. I mean,
but just to mention that the cutting to the arm thing is a very rare thing. Yeah. Which doesn't mean that it's an uncommon thing, or so maybe it's something that they know how to cut to the arm, so everyone else just skipped it. But it's a very rare thing to actually see, and you also can cut to the arm in the sources. I even think it is isn't it even a triangular shaped rondel in that case, or is it one like the ones that Björn has with
like this? Even the triangular shaped rondel daggers might be quite sharp. Yeah. I mean, you have some that really are formed like that. They will cut through things. And one thing that might really be true is that was such an ordinary thing that nobody dared to or thought about mentioning it. It's also the same as in grappling. There are some things that are not mentioned. Also in longsword fighting, some of the techniques like the Zorna, how is it executed, some other things, it comes later on. In the later manuals, not in the early ones, because everybody knows how to do that. So I don't have to teach that.
I think we interrupted Daniele before he was able to make his actual point. Sorry. And by we, I mean I.
Sorry, I forgot my actual point.
you were talking about Marozzo being maybe not the exceptional, but being one of the few instances of having these.
It's right what Lille Björn said. He is very unique in that way. But I was just saying there are other sources that earlier sources that go into the same idea. That's what I want to say. But now I want to say something to Predrag, and he said, okay, no, what do I want to say? Okay, just one thing. Arm cutting and attacks to the arm. How often do you see attacks to the arm in longsword fencing? Very, very seldomly, because most things start with going attacks to the head or to the, and then you start reacting the other one, and then you start to get into the hands. At least what I remember when I go into longsword, most of the attacks start really to go for the body and for the head. And the cutting to the hand, I mean, that you snap on somebody's hand is somehow normal. I mean, that is not really described in most cases. That's what I want to say, just relation to this. What he
said. So this exactly what you're pointing out is the reason that I spend a lot of time on the guards in Meyer, talking about how they are all like clinging to your body, just exactly because of that. Because if you put it out here, you're offering a shallow target. So then Paulus Kahl's techniques of cutting will work great. And you can essentially see that. Yeah, that's why they keep their hands away, because you put them forward, somebody's going to cut them. And so the fact that the guards look like they do means that cutting is something they were aware of, right?
Mm.
Otherwise, they wouldn't care about it. They would just put their hands out here because it would be easier. So that's one thing. The other thing is that a lot, maybe perhaps the majority of the other manuals, if we aside from Joachim Meyer, Paulus Hector Meyer, I think Minofiore, but a lot of them are just, they are fragments. They are parts of a Hausbuch or something like this. So they are what, 5, 6, 7, sometimes 12, 20 techniques, but it's not a system. It's not a complete system. This is like, yeah, this is the secrets of the Johnson family, or whatever they happen to write down. So it's not necessarily representative. Whereas Paulus Hector Meyer, Joachim Meyer, and Marozzo, and I think Fiore are actually trying to show complete systems. Whether they succeed or not is another thing, but they're at least trying to. Whereas the others are just, more random collections of it. And as I think we touched upon earlier, we know that there were people who spent more time on it. Like there is this guy who is called Dietrich Degenfechter von Braunschweig, I think, who's mentioned in the Society of Lichtnauer, or the Brotherhood of Lichtnauer, whatever they're called. So the fact that he is mentioned means that, he probably had more stuff on Dagger. Unfortunately, we have zero manuals or anything from him. But my point here is that I think there's lots of things that are missing. And the fact that they're missing doesn't mean that they're missing in the manuals, doesn't mean that they didn't exist.
Which is, I think, a point kind of getting back to the white dagger, though, thing in the terms of HEMA, because it's important historically. Like you have a person specifically singled out for doing that. That, again, might be because it's so seldom that you have to point it out. You go, oh, that's rather exotic. Or because it's just a common thing to have, and you have this one guy who's just specifically just doing dagger, maybe exclusively, or maybe just being very good at that. At least that's what he is known for. So that's a very important point to make at this point. But also, Predrag wanted to chime in on what you said.
Yeah, about the manuals not having or not being complete and so on. That's the thing that I was always mentioning in wrestling and in dagger fighting. The things that were written down in the beginning, later on, when they were really trying to teach people a system, like Joachim Meyer, Paulus Hector Meyer wasn't doing teaching a system. He was more like, I'm collecting all the things and I want to have everything in it. And so Liegnitzer, he was showing the special techniques. So he's got 7, I think he's got 7 dagger plays and the counters to that. So you have about 12 plays altogether from Liegnitzer. Those are really nice things, but there's some things missing because it was just common knowledge. At least that's what I think. And that's what I think also you mentioned. They're just broken parts of the system, because they were saying, okay, everybody knows how to use a dagger. Everybody knows how to stab like this and how to attack like this. I wanted to show you some stuff that I think is especially good to help you get the upper hand. So that's where a lot of things are missing, where we are really struggling about recreating the things and knowing, okay, that's what was meant. Sometimes you say, okay, and how does the attack go that I have to defend against, because it's nowhere mentioned. You have that longsword fighting, you have that in wrestling, and so on, and dagger fighting as well. And I think that's one of the main aspects why some things are not really mentioned, but the thrust from the straight thrust with the dagger in the front. It is mentioned, but not as often as it might have been occurred in everyday life. And the cut to the hand, I love the cut to the hand or the elbow or the wrist. It really is so annoying to the person, even if I'm not using a sharp dagger. And I'd go there and they drop the weapons quite often because it's the impact. If it's sharp, they will lose the grip they need. And so I can do other stuff. So once again, maybe it was such, because you said, Björn, it was such, or was it Daniele? I don't know. It was such a common occurrence. Yeah, you mentioned, because that's why I keep my hand in the position like here and here and not here. Because, okay, I lost my dagger. Bummer. And I think that's one of the main things. A lot of things were common knowledge because dagger was something that was part of your clothing. So kids learned to use dagger. Kids learned how to use wrestling techniques. Wrestling was really something completely basic. People in the pub were fighting and then they were wrestling. They were punching each other in the face. So that's why most punches are not mentioned in the manuals. I mean, we have some we have some Mordstöße in Ringen. We have some knees in Auerswald and Dürer or Wallerstein, but not that much else. And I don't think they were not punching each other in the face, in the lights out, or kicking the nuts and so on. So those were basic things, and the early manuals didn't use them because why should I write down stuff that everybody knows? The early manuals are more like, I will write down the stuff as a reminder what you could do upon that, or to show you this is what I go above that. And that's why I think that a lot of things in dagger fighting are not written down.
So basically analog to the other fencing books, so the other fencing, top class, top level fencing. So basically, yeah.
Yes, yes.
And to tie back to what we originally started, because we kind of deviated a little bit from the topic, but I think that's completely okay. So one of the things that we kind of mentioned, but which also ties into why it's so close to grappling, is because there's lots more instances, both likely, I think the probability of you ending up in a situation where you are unarmed and the opponent is armed, and there is also a lot of more pages devoted to this than in any other weapon. I mean, like we said, there's almost zero. I mean, like percentage-wise, there's almost zero cases where people are unarmed and defend against other weapons, whereas dagger is like super common. And if you're unarmed and I have a dagger, if we anyway are going to fight and all that running part is out of the picture, then grappling or wrestling is almost the only choice you've got in at least as long as we're following the definition of wrestling that we kind of agreed upon here. So I think that's also one of the reasons, because there's a higher likelihood and there's a larger focus on the fact that you might either not have a dagger or haven't had the time to draw your dagger yet. I think this is one of the reasons.
That's maybe the latter part of your sentence deserves more attention there, because if, for example, we look at Fiore, we have a lot of techniques, unarmed versus dagger. That's like most of his dagger section is like that. And then at some point, randomly, the technique that you're being shown is, trap him, stab him. You know, where does the dagger come from? It's not like mentioned somewhere, but there's a dagger somewhere all of a sudden. And when you look at, I think it's Hundfeld again, when you look at Hundfeld, he even says, if your opponent has drawn the dagger and you haven't yet, then do this. That's why you do unarmed defenses against the dagger in Hundfeld. Again, that's the guy who gave us Unterhalten, so pretty much armored fighting context there. But yeah, I think the idea of I'm not armed at all with anything might be pretty subtle, because you at least have an eating knife or anything on your hands. but I might want to defend against that thing coming on there, and as Predrag says, control them and keeping them from attacking me and from hurting me before I grab my own dagger, because I don't have anything from having a dagger in my hand while lying bleeding on the floor. So wrestling is the go-to option there because of the distance I'm in, and that ties in again to what you, Björn, said about the guards, basically, because not only does this keep you from cutting my hand, it also keeps you from grabbing it, right? Because as soon as we are in Ringen distance, that's what you are going to do. You're going to get in and control me, and the only thing I can do for that is keep my limbs out of the way so you can't grab them directly, and then try to gain control over you and stab you. And which is probably why we get into situations, as Hunfeld mentions, if you haven't drawn your weapon yet. In that context, I have my primary weapon, which is a lance or mordaxe or whatever, poleaxe. And then I have my secondary weapon, which is my longsword. And then I have my tertiary weapon, which is my dagger. But in that case, if I get into that distance where drawing the dagger is an option, that means having my poleaxe or my longsword is basically having no weapon at all, because it's not really useful in that distance. I can try to do some half sorting in Ringen am Schwert and things like that, but basically I haven't drawn my dagger yet, because all I can do to defend against the guy with a dagger in that distance is Ringen and then trying to get my own dagger out. So that's basically the distance thing comes into it again, and the armored fighting context in a certain way. So.
Oh Jesus, yeah. So, I think also that that the fact that when you're in the when you're looking at Meyer, it's funny because it's the exact opposite of what you described in Fiore. Meyer starts with a dagger, and he starts with dagger versus dagger, and all of a sudden, without him actually giving you context or anything, it's like, yeah, and then you grab him like this, and with the other hand you control him, and I'm like, but where's my dagger? No, you don't have a dagger here, and he doesn't even tell you. You kind of have to like just deduct from it, because otherwise this hand would be occupied holding the dagger, and then it turns into wrestling, whereas Fiore starts with the wrestling, if I understand correctly. But I understand that it's very often, I think Marky Berryman, which will come on here at some point later, talks very much about abbracare and dagger as one coherent unit in Fiore, and so it starts with the wrestling, whereas Meyer kind of starts with the dagger and then turns into wrestling. I don't know why, but it's very clear that the connection is still what Fiore is from. When the earliest Fiore source is from
1400s somewhere, I think.
I think it's earlier, isn't it? Daniele, do you have a more specific?
Which one?
The earliest Fiore.
1440s. 1440s.
1440s. Okay.
I think. Yeah.
I thought it was even earlier. I thought it was like end of 14th century, but I
thought so as well,
but never mind.
I don't think we have sources from there.
Okay.
Well, the earliest we have, apparently, and was still debated, is the Lichtenauer Zettel from 1380, something about that. And everything else we have is German manuals, but even Italian, as far as I can remember, but is from about 1430, 1440.
The Lichtenauer Hausbuch is actually it's dated from 1389 up to 1494, so it's not really, we don't really know, but again, it's that doesn't matter.
But I said in the summer, that's the earliest we have, and that is late 1400s.
But I think that my point here is, I think, is valid despite this. My point was actually that from the earliest manuals we have with dagger to the latest, at least in the medieval Renaissance period. I mean, if you go into 17th century, 17th century, it starts looking so different that they were kind of into another ballpark. But in the medieval Renaissance period, dagger and wrestling seems to be completely interconnected. It might have changed that dagger is more important than wrestling at the end, and wrestling was more important in the beginning, but it's still completely intertwined. I mean, this here is Meyer's 1570. Oh, anybody see those just white weird pages? But anyway, if you can see, on the same page is both, on the same picture is both just grappling wrestling techniques without any weapons and wrestling techniques with daggers. So it's clearly that this is still 200-300 years later exactly as important. And to tie in why grappling is so important, I mean,
just so nobody gets mad at us, I just looked it up, and most of the Fiore manuscripts are dated to about 1400 to 1409. So because he died 1409, presumably, so it would be weird if he wrote anything after that, but somewhere around that, just so nobody shouts at us in the comments or something.
Yeah. So essentially we have about a 300-year span. I mean, 1571 is Gründliche Beschreibung der Kunsten des Fechtens, I think, which is Joachim Meyer's 1571. But there is one later one with him, so he was like at end of 15th century, so that's almost 300 years. And if we take from Fiore's earlier, even if he wrote something in 1400, that means what he did was in the 1300s, right? I mean, he's.
Yeah, I think he was born something like 1350s or something.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So most of his career would actually have been in the 14th century. So we could say that the material is from the 14th century, even though the manual is dated later. Yeah.
So we still have this connection of either the abbrazzare going into the dagger, or the dagger going into the wrestling, and we often have people dealing with both of these things. I think Liegnitzer, for example, has stuff on wrestling, and then he has stuff on dagger. So the people who kind of pop up for specific things, the chances are high that if they just pop up for one or two things, and one of them is dagger, the other one probably is wrestling as well. So yeah, there seems to be a very strong connection. I think, as we pointed out, some of that might be because of context, because of armor playing a role in that, or because of kind of this bar brawl, mundane culture thing, being unarmed even maybe might play a role in it, and the distance that you have plays a huge role in it, because it's basically Ringen distance, and what you want to do, as Daniele has pointed out, is to stop this very chaotic thing and just gain whatever control you can have, and that is what you do by controlling your opponent's body directly. So I think that kind of sums up the few hundred years of dagger fighting that we've been talking about today.
Yeah.
So if you agree, if you're right with that, I would kind of get to an end of the discussion at that point, and maybe I like the idea of maybe all of us taking a turn and maybe summing up what they are taking away from this discussion. Maybe we start the way that we began by asking Björn, what do you take away from this evening?
First of all, I think it was a bit more. We have actually had this conversation before, and what happened then, and what I think is kind of happening now, is that we are quite in agreement upon most of this. That the reason for the importance of wrestling is both the fact that you were very likely to encounter it both as a civilian, and there is the armored context where it is very important, because it's one of those weapons. If you don't have like a poleaxe, then dagger is perhaps your best weapon, poleaxe or something similar against somebody in armor. And the fact that it was like the weapon that you would encounter the most, and that you yourself would wear the most, and the fact that the distance is is the same as the grappling. So these kind of factors kind of together are the reasons that grappling is so important. And like Predrag talked about, the fact that you're actually wrestling with the weapon to a larger extent. I know there's something called Ringen am Schwert, but I think that the Ringen am Dolk is a lot more common and actually
you don't
a lot
even
more.
Say it. It's just what you do.
Yeah, exactly. It's not even a term. It's all just, we just call it dagger. Yeah, so that's me.
Well, Predrag, what do you take away from tonight?
Well, yeah, we had the conversation already once before without Daniele, but so this time happy to have you with us on board, and some new inputs from that. For me, it's yeah, it's difficult to say. I'm agreeing with Björn on that one because we're in agreement. The dagger is, I think, the most prominent weapon that you have in everyday life in medieval times, and so that's the weapon of choice you go to if you have to defend yourself in a situation that you're not prepared for, or it's your last chance because yeah, I've used all my weapons in the duel. So okay, and I think a lot of people should really focus on that part of actually doing wrestling and dagger fighting more into their curricula in their clubs, because it really shows you a lot about the bind, it shows you a lot about distance and strength and weakness. I can attack your strength with my strength. That's stupid, yeah, because okay, I'll see who's stronger, but that doesn't prove a point. But if I go against your weakness with your strength with my weakness and go against you with that, and that's the thing that you can really learn in dagger fighting as well and in wrestling, and the combination of both. So yeah, it would be nice to see more parts of that in HEMA at all. And I remember I was doing going to workshops or events in the 2001s, 2002, somewhere about that line, first Rhine event, Ox events and so on. And most of the times there was no dagger or grappling. And that came later on. Always some, but not that many. And it's still not that prominent. So I would really love to have more clubs really focus on that. But a lot of people are worried. I've seen that in my club. The people said, oh, no, it's too close and dirty and so on. No, I like to have the sword because it's the great equalizer. And I don't want to have an equalizer. I want to be close and personal. And yeah, I might not get out without the scratch, but at least I'm feeling you. And if you kill me, okay, so yeah, it wasn't something unpersonal, it was some personal thing. So yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Daniele, for you as a first timer in this conversation, what are your points? What do you take away from this?
Yeah, I think I won't say too much because it becomes redundant. I can also say that we are mostly in agreement with most things, 99%. And yeah, just was fun to talk to you and to talk about it. And yeah, so it becomes redundant because everybody said already what I would say also.
Okay, good. I think we have to, because Predrag mentioned a very important thing that at the very end we have to talk about training dagger and the psychological aspects of training dagger in a different video then. What I take away from this is, on the one hand, that the questions that we kind of agreed on beforehand, like why dagger, because that's a good introductory question for doing a dagger, whatever this is, vodcast or whatever you call it, and the question of what's the connection of grappling and dagger, basically have the same answers, right? The answer is because you do it in everyday life and it's context and it's the kind of the same reach thingy, and it's so very basic. it's the same answer for why should I train the dagger more? Because it's so very basic, and it is the historical context for a lot of the people whose works we are studying. And when Predrag mentioned wrestling is what you teach the kids, and then maybe they get a dagger, and maybe then they get something else. That reminded me of like years ago when I was at uni. I had this module on the Japanese Middle Ages, which by itself is a term that doesn't make any sense in terms of Japan, but right. And they talked about these sources of people in the palace and the kind of weapons they were trained in. So like every stable boy had to know how to do judo, and then you had these, or jujutsu or whatever, and then you had every cook also learned how to do that, but they also learned that. Like they had these lists of what the staff were trained in, and it kind of built up from everyone around you could do unarmed stuff. Some of them would then learn knife stuff. Some of them would then learn staff, and then you got to the people with the swords in the end. And that kind of seems to be maybe not as formally produced, but in the way it seems to be true for the historical European martial arts as well. This is kind of like most of the people do Ringen in some kind, like some of them like unprofessionally in the pub, but like most of them do Ringen, and then the smaller percentage, but still a huge amount, does something with daggers or knives or something similar. And then you I kind of see that overarching connection even to Japan in that regards there, that maybe the fact that a lot of the martial arts that have been studied over the ages from the Asian part of the world are unarmed. The same should be true for us as well. Maybe we should be focusing way more on the Ringen, and then on the dagger, and then on the other stuff, because that's where we learn a lot of stuff that is kind of not mentioned in the later manuals, or later in the sense of the sword and the staff and whatever manuals, because you should have learned that when you learned wrestling. So I guess there's a very strong connection, and it helps you see this kind of line, this train of thought going through all of the different weapons if you start looking at wrestling and the dagger, which kind of is intertwined.
But getting thrown hurts.
Yes, if you do it wrong, and that's probably what we should talk about in the next session.
Just getting stabbed hurts as well.
Yeah, we should talk about the psychological and physiological differences of training dagger as opposed to maybe training the sexy longsword or the staff weapons or whatever. Maybe that's the topic for the next.
Sounds good.
Show.
I think so, because last time we had this conversation, we kind of touched upon it, but I think that kind of like why people who are currently not doing dagger and perhaps not wrestling should really go into it is basically the short answer is dagger is the way to understand how weapons and wrestling interact. And wrestling is, as I think basically everybody in HEMA agrees upon, even if they don't do it, is the core of the fighting. And if you're scared, which I think a lot of people actually are, from getting that up close personal contact, yes, getting that close contact, then dagger is perhaps actually the nicest and the most. You used a really nice word, Daniele. You said that it was the
didactic.
The didactic tool to teach it. I think that was a very good way of saying it. Yes. So that's why everybody should be doing more dagger.
Okay,
and more.
So
yeah.
Next time, physiological and psychological differences in training dagger as opposed to anything else, maybe aside from wrestling.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, guys.
All right.
See you again.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you back. Bye-bye.